Hello. Delighted that you could join us on this Google Hangout. And thank you, first of all, for enrolling on this course called Human Rights and Human Wrongs. It's a great pleasure to be here with Sarah. Sarah, do you want to say hello?
Hello.
It's a new interface for us. We hope that the interface has been working well. And we also hope that the course is giving you the kinds of things that you hoped it would when you were first intrigued enough to enroll with it. The questions that you've sent us have been great, and we hope to address some of these questions in this particular session. But I'd like to stress that my aspiration is that this will be a dialogue. We may not be able to pick up many of the questions that you have, but I'm hoping that over time we'll get to some of these themes. When we first set out, Sarah, on agreeing to do this MOOC, we felt that there was a real gap there in how people perceived sustainable development, gender, and human rights. And we felt that in bringing these themes together, we would really start addressing an audience and, I guess, directing people towards solutions and not problems. So we're hoping that the modules will do that and the various units will do that. But please do weigh in with problems from where you are, from your perspective, but weigh in also with solutions. We would like other people to understand how it is that societies are facing up to some of these challenges. And we want, in understanding those challenges, for other people to start getting new ideas on how many of these issues could be tackled. But as we've titled the course, there are human rights, but there are also human wrongs. I think the reason for the title is the fact that it is based on a rights-based agenda as located in law, but there are so many other perspectives beyond law that law simply cannot touch. And understanding how those social attitudes could change is fundamental for the world in 2030. So thank you very much for your questions. I'm going to start addressing some of these. We've grouped these questions. So just to give you an idea of how we're going to structure this particular session, the first set of questions seems to pertain to culture and its interface with human rights. I'm going to address some of those. Sarah will address some of them, and we'll hopefully have a discussion and a dialogue. It goes without saying, we don't necessarily agree on everything, and that's also part of what we want to bring to you, because there aren't clear-cut, straightforward, black and white answers, and we don't want to portray the world in those forms. And we'd like to encourage you to weigh in with your opinions.
Can I just say that I think when we first started doing this, one of the reasons we actually decided to do it together was because we don't have the same opinions, we don't have the same backgrounds, and you will hear discussion between Joshua and I during this. And as Joshua said, we would like to hear what you think also, because I'm sure you'll have other opinions. So hopefully Brilliant. It will be an ongoing dialogue.
I think also very importantly for us, we want to hear the location of these issues and how they sit where you are, because that's sometimes so important as well, where you are physically, geographically, but also where you are socioeconomically. All of those perspectives are important. And I think we've never really had education too often has been a one-way street where there are the experts, and the experts disseminate some pre-digested information in the vain hope that the listeners will make some relevance of it. We're hoping to get away from that model. And
I think this will.
This will. We hope so. We hope so. So we'll start off with addressing some of the questions on culture, hopefully to your satisfaction, but do come back if they aren't. Sarah, then you're going to address the question on humanitarianism per se,
and disaster,
and also the question of whether human rights are only relevant in times of disaster. In which case we have plenty of relevance at the moment because we have disasters all over the place. I want to tackle then questions around a colleague from Uganda who's asked a question about what are human wrongs, and also the pertinence of human rights in a context of intrastate conflict. I want to say a little bit about indigenous rights. I'm afraid I'm going to give you more homework on that, but I'm going to address the question as well on what indigenous rights mean into the future. Then we thought we would take a joint approach to addressing questions that we have grouped as pertaining to the world in 2030 and how some of the ideas in this MOOC can challenge contemporary wisdom. We've got a number of substrands to that question that we will share. And then hopefully we'll finish the session by addressing the question of whether law is the right forum for human rights. And there you'll see our glaring disagreements. And we hope that that'll be amusing for you as well as educational. Okay, Sarah, do you want to start with that question pertaining to diversity? So Alam has asked us a question on whether essentially a diverse society needs diverse rights.
It's an interesting question because when you think about rights, you think, well, actually, we all need a basic set of rights, a common set of rights. But our society is very diverse, and we do have diverse groups. And if we think about gender, then of course we're looking already at one big distinction between two groups. But even when we think about gender, often it's being constructed as male-female dichotomy based on sex, but we know within gender it's a spectrum, and there's different groups along that spectrum. So to just say man, woman based on sex, then that's wrong in itself. So this diversity issue enters often when we talk diversity in gender sense, and we start talking about women, but really the diversity is that whole spectrum that we need to engage with, and that's so little engaged with still within human rights. So when we're talking about a diverse society needing diverse rights, I would agree that yes, different groups need to have their rights protected in different ways. So it's not just a diversity of rights, it's a diversity of ways of actually addressing those rights also. But then I don't come from a legal perspective, so I'm not sure how that fits with those legal frameworks then.
I mean, in a sense, again, legal frameworks are like other frameworks too. There are some minimum standards, there are some minimum conceptual agreements, and certainly the conceptual agreement that I would like you to think about is the fact that the human rights agenda, as has been agreed and as has been codified at international level, is a series of minimum standards that pertain to every human being, irrespective of their identity, irrespective of their location in society. So that is, in a sense, a minimum standard. But Alam, your question is a good one, because obviously where you experience the rights from makes a big difference to what those rights are going to be. I fully endorse what Sarah's saying with regards to how this plays out in a gendered sense. But let me also challenge you with the following. If you end up having differential rights for differential groups based on who they are, you undermine a fundamental purpose of human rights, which is the maintenance and the belief in the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. That is a fundamental principle. It's a lodestone. Now, that ties in quite nicely to the question really on, so where does culture fit in? Let me say to you, and we will address this again, I suspect, when we talk about challenges, but let me say to you that in a sense, human rights too is a culture. In the context of how we see this, it's based on the belief that there is an inherent dignity and worth in every individual. And that doesn't matter whether they're female or male. That does not matter whether they're rich or poor. That does not matter whether they are ethnically in the majority, of whether they are in the ethnically majority group or the ethnic minority group. It doesn't matter. What matters most is that by virtue of being human, you have certain rights that accrue to you. So you need then a certain, I would argue, a certain base level of rights that guarantee and uphold that dignity and worth. And I think this also pertains to the question that Pedro asked. Pedro Pereira Leite, thank you for your question, where you ask whether the question of whether human dignity in some way captures this. And Sarah, you wanted to say something about whether that does.
The notion of human dignity has been, as Josh was saying, is really central and really fundamental when we're talking about human rights. But what's interesting is human dignity hasn't really been talked about in a central or fundamental way when we talk about development. And that's not just because development for so many years has been focused around economic growth, but even now when we're talking about people-centered, when we're talking about sustainable development, this notion of human dignity is only now really being discussed. And that's really interesting, because really when you think about development and why are we developing, why are we wanting to alleviate poverty, why are we wanting to move forward and advance, it should be around human dignity and ensuring a dignified life for all. But it's not been central in the past. So it's very interesting to me that only now is human dignity coming in, and it's coming in very specific ways around work, for example. So it's not in this wider context of the right to human dignity. It's in this context of labour standards, for example. So it's reducing it down. So this big notion of human dignity, which should be so central, just isn't. And maybe that's because it's very difficult to operationalise.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of developing human rights standards, certainly the discussion on human dignity was at the forefront. The difficulty with dignity is it tends to be more subjective. Whereas rights tend to be those that have been codified, written down, enshrined in law, and are accessible. But therein lies the problem, of course, because in many cases, and certainly in subsequent weeks, you look at the rights that have been enshrined, but just because they've been enshrined doesn't mean they're available. And that's the challenge. So rights for me is better in the sense that they are enshrined, but the problem is that that's only a half-built house. If those rights are not accessible, well, they're as vague then. So if you are in a part of the world where you don't have the freedom of expression, the fact that freedom of expression is a codified right is pretty meaningless to you. And I think Sarah addresses this when she talks about the fact that rights are nice, but are they enough? And I think those are some of the nitty-gritty technical issues we're trying to get hold of. But in conceptual terms, yes, there is a correlation between human dignity and human rights. But I would say that human rights are based on an attempt to uphold human dignity. So human rights are the path to maintaining human dignity. They're trying to produce something of a root to it.
But the problem also with human dignity, it comes back to the gender notions, because in gender terms, people talk about women maintaining their dignity. And what that really means is a very different thing than men. And it's the idea of women being quiet and wearing suitable clothing and not short skirts and not doing certain things. And that's used, the word dignity is used in that sense in a way to control women, not to give them rights or freedom of expression. So it can be used in the other way also. And that's why it's problematic. And that's we're back to the diversity of rights notion.
And I think, just to close that discussion off, we would argue, I think, jointly, that there are certain minimum standards, and that those minimum standards are not necessarily prevalent in all the societies in which we live. So the human rights agenda is a challenging one, and it will challenge, and there will be difficult questions that come up. We deal with them, questions like abortion, questions around the extent to which women around the world have equal access to land rights, have equal access to finance. We ask those questions, and in asking those questions, we're touching on nerves, and we're touching on quite controversial aspects because of the fact that culture is often played as a card to deny rights. And our argument, and I think Sarah shares this view with me, is culture is dynamic. Culture is not static. So when we talk about culture, if that culture is based on the domination of one individual, or indeed a group of individuals, by one set of individuals, it's a problem. So I would say culture can be wrong. Culture needs to be modified. Culture needs to be replaced with a more egalitarian understanding of what we're trying to protect. So same rights for everyone? Yes, up to a point is probably how I would leave it. There's another aspect of that, of the culture question I just want to touch on before we move to humanitarianism and the question of human rights in the context of disasters. And that's the question asked, and I'm sorry you don't identify yourself. It would be great if people, by the way, did identify themselves so we could speak to you through this wonderful modern technology that we have. The question on multiculturalism and what's the impact of that on human rights. It's a really pertinent question because of the fact that what we have seen, certainly in the 20th century, and has continued in even more dramatic terms in the 21st century, is that people no longer inhabit only the space in which they were born. The vast mass movements of people mean that now there are groups in various different states that are not autochthonous to that particular state. Inevitably, that means that cultures come up against each other in much sharper contrast. What does human rights provide in that discussion? Well, hopefully human rights provides a way in which the public space can be regulated in such a manner that all the inherent dignities and worth of every individual can be upheld. But hopefully it also provides the space for groups within those societies to pursue their own cultural ethos and pursue their own values. Still, a caveat I would argue is that if any of those cultures are based on a domination of one group by another, be it gender or any other, then that culture for me is problematic, and that culture doesn't merit the kind of protection we're trying to talk about. Sarah, do you want to say anything about multiculturalism? You're going to address the questions of humanitarianism and disasters in any case, but
I find it very interesting whenever there's a question about multiculturalism. And I'm going to bring it back very personally because I grew up in a period when that was all that was talked about in the UK in terms of policy. And the school I went to was deemed to be a multicultural school. And it was put forward at that time as being really forward-looking and the way to go. And then there was a backlash against that. And then it was, oh no, because you can't have multiculturalism and we have to think more about the individual cultures. So I think it's an ongoing discussion. And again, we've got this culture at the center of it and how we live with different cultures in different contexts across different groups of people. So it's an ongoing question. I think we're going to pick it up week after week after week. I've got a feeling across the different questions.
Yeah, do read, by the way, this, if you search on Human Rights Quarterly, there's a great piece by Bonnie Ibawo IBAWOH. We can send the reference on the discussion board. But she's written quite a good piece there on cultural relativism, specifically in the context of gendered rights. I'm sure Sarah can provide other references. And please, if you do have questions for more reading, please do ask us that as well, because we can give you our takes, but our takes are based on some of the literature and some of the understanding of the ways in which these play out. And it would be great for you to engage with that literature as well. Sorry, Sarah, go on.
No, it's fine. So the next set of questions were vaguely grouped under the notion of humanitarianism and disasters. And we had a question around humanitarianism from Khaloud Al-Husani. And I want to thank you for that question, because watch this space, in a few weeks' time, we're going to have a module that's looking at humanitarianism. And the question was very much around whether humanitarian organizations are going to be in conflict with the countries in which they intervene. And again, you're back to this notion of culture, because often humanitarian agents come from outside, move into a culture of which they know little about, and they have these very set ideas around, when we're saving lives, we know what we need to do, and we just go in and do it. And that can come up against cultures as they exist. So it is still a cultural question. Now, I don't want to go too far into it here, because I said I don't want to spoil it for future weeks, because we want you to keep watching. But in a few weeks' time, I think it's Unit 9 or 10, coming up quite late on, and we're going to talk more about humanitarianism there. But related to that, we had a question around disasters, and unfortunately there's no name on this one either. And the question was, does the question of human rights arise only in times of disasters? Now, I find this a really interesting question, because for many people who work in the post-disaster context, that's exactly the time when human rights go out the window. Humanitarian actors, relief organization, reconstruction, that's when we don't think about rights. So development organizations, often very much rights focused, very much focused on trying to ensure participation, consultation, all these community-based approaches, right-centered approaches. And then when we have a disaster, afterwards, in the relief period, everyone says, oh no, we don't have time for that. And big rights, the rights around the right to shelter, to food, etc., they're actually fulfilled, but they're not expressed as rights. These are moral obligations from countries to respond. There's no legal aspect that means you have to go in and respond. So they're very much constructed around needs, and they're very much constructed around helping people, not in the sense that those people have rights. Now, this has, NGOs in particular have tried to work to change this and tried to think more back to the word dignity. And very much dignity has come back into some of the particularly NGOs' work practices and guidances. But the idea that rights are something that are very much in focus in times of post-disaster, absolutely, I'd argue the opposite. That's when we see them moving away from rights, and in particular, rights such as gendered rights. And for example, and again, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but in a few weeks' time, we're going to talk again about disasters, and we're going to talk also about the Sendai framework, which is the International Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. And there, the idea of rights such as gendered rights or sexual and reproductive health rights, they are not within that framework, because these are not seen as appropriate to be talked about in the post-disaster context. When it's about needs, and there's this notion of the tyranny of the urgent. We don't have time to do that because we've got to get on and save lives. So the right to life, of course, is a basic right, but it shouldn't overrule all of our rights. And what we often find post-disaster is that it does. And in this humanitarian, I'm always told off for doing this, humanitarian space, then the notion of rights, for me, is often actually not that clear. I don't know what your take on that is, Joshua.
No, I mean, again, the human rights framework is meant to be applicable at all times, because at all times, there is a need to protect the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. So there's no question human rights are not suspended at times of disasters, even though it's intrinsic in the way human rights are framed that at times of national emergencies, when they are declared and for a limited period of time, certain rights can be suspended. But that has to be declared well, not in advance, because certainly once the disaster is unfolding, a state has to make a declaration saying we are now in a state of emergencies. And then it's got to say what specific rights are suspended. We call those derogations in human rights law, and you'll find them in the 3 regional conventions that exist that you will have started getting some familiarity on, and it's also in the international framework of rights. And that's just an understanding that there will be times in the life of a state when, due to the exigencies it's facing, it has to suspend certain rights. But clearly, even in that context, you can't suspend the right to life. So there are certain rights that are labeled as being non-derogable. That means under no circumstance can you ever violate that particular rights. There are other rights, such as rights that may exist to freedom of speech, where you might say, well, this is a time when we have to calm people down and not incite violence and not incite aggression. And so we might put certain restrictions on freedom of speech. But bear in mind, the law says very clearly that if you put those restrictions in place, they have to be time bound. They have to be very specific to respond to the exigency of the situation. And you have to explain exactly what bit of the right is suspended. So it's not just that you can say, well, oh, there's a volcano has erupted, I'm going to stop and close down the free press. That doesn't make sense. There has to be a logic to what you're doing, and you have to be able to post facto justify why you've done it to redress this particular situation.
But you see, that's very much at that legal level.
Yeah.
And what I'm talking about is how it plays out
in
on
reality.
The ground and on reality. So you don't say, okay, we're going to shut down the press, but then when the press try and rebuild their factory that had been fallen down in a particular location, you say, oh, sorry, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Or you move people out of certain areas, or you silence them by not letting them go back. So these sorts of violations of rights go on, but also in the sense of how people give aid during that time. It's not a rights-based, it's a service-based approach. And that's what I mean by this notion that rights, they might still legally exist, but they don't exist in the reality of the people. It's not at the forefront of the giver's, the donor's mind necessarily. This is a rights issue. But also I think what's important to look about that, and as you were talking, I was just thinking that when you talk about human rights being arise only in times of disaster, the thing about disasters is, in essence, they actually show us when rights have been violated, and that's why we get the disaster for certain people. Because events like hurricanes or earthquakes, yes, they can affect everyone, but they affect some people more than others. And often that is those people who are more vulnerable, who are those who have had their rights violated in the past or their rights not upheld. So disasters, for me, in terms of rights, what they help show, they make visible those differences, those inequalities, including inequalities around access to rights and rights being upheld. So they make these visible. They reveal a lack of protection. They reveal a lack of service provision. They reveal the fact that those people have not been, development hasn't occurred for those people, and their rights thus have been violated in that sense. So instead of they arise only in times of disasters, they're revealed in times of disasters. We reveal this difference in terms of rights, and then in terms of whether we respond to that, I would argue in the short term, no, we don't. In fact, we further violate rights in some instances.
Which is actually a neat bridge to the question that intrigued our colleague from Uganda, who talked about what are human wrongs. And I mean, these are examples of human wrongs. And I guess the first human wrong is the fact that they occur. The second human wrong is the fact that we seem to have no real ability in being able to, first of all, understand them, and secondly, being able to find remedies for them. And I think that concept of human wrongs is pretty much what we are putting out there, that human rights, sure, are the ones that are enshrined in law with all their rhetorical brilliance. But actually, when they don't play out in reality of the kinds of the realities that Sarah's talking about, but realities of intrastate conflict, realities of what's happening in the Middle East, they become human wrongs. And they become human wrongs really because they promise an aspiration they can't deliver. And is that better or worse? Well, it's even worse to think that everybody is meant to have rights, but some of them have it and you don't. Relative poverty and absolute poverty are examples of this, where if everybody is in poverty, the fact that you don't have is perhaps something you can live with to a certain extent. It's a terrible thing. You need to collectively solve it, but it's a shared experience. Well, if on the other hand, everybody around you has wealth and you're the only one that doesn't, and there's some structural reason why you're even being denied that, then that becomes a very much a greater wrong. I think that human wrong concept is probably relevant in explaining some of that paradigm as well. But one of the questions asked, and again, we don't have a name for the individual who asked it, but it's a good question, is the extent to which intrastate conflict is more and more the norm, and interstate conflict is perhaps diminishing. Now, some might argue, again, depends on where you are. If you are in Syria or Iraq at the moment, is that interstate or intrastate? It's hard to know. But primarily, it is true that the setup in terms of the United Nations, if you look at the aspiration of the United Nations Charter, it starts by saying something to the effect of, we, the people of the United Nations, having witnessed the scourge of warfare twice in our lifetime. And it goes on to then talk about the framework that we need to collectively build. And of course, when it talks about scourge of warfare twice in our lifetime, clearly the scourge was World War I and World War II. But World War I and World War II were not the only world wars occurring. There were lots of wars occurring, whether or not you want to call them world wars, whether they involved across many states or not, they were wars nonetheless, and they led to significant bloodshed, and they led to significant upheaval. Making human rights relevant in those contexts is fundamental. Now, in terms of international law, we make the distinction of what rights are applicable at wartime, and we call it international humanitarian law or laws of armed conflict. But again, that's of limited utility in understanding some of these issues. The central feature you always keep coming back to is we need to create robust mechanisms which protect the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, not just in times of peace, not just in times of disaster, not just in times of war, but in every circumstance, everywhere, all the time. And that is the central challenge we have, because that challenge involves creating legislative, administrative mechanisms from a legal side that will uphold those rights. But Sarah would argue that it consists of a mindset shift. And that mindset shift is as important, because the paternalistic state, even if that paternalistic state had the most sophisticated regime of laws and regulations, if it was operating in a conceptual gap, they would be meaningless. And I think that is the challenge that we hope to address in many of the modules through different lenses on this particular question. Sarah, do you want to add something to that?
No, I think you've just said what I would think, and you're right.
And it's rare that Sarah will agree that I have said what she might think on it. Okay, let me move to the question of indigenous people's rights. And again, a specific question here about indigenous rights and the future. Now, there's a great article by Benedict Kingsbury that you must try and read, and I can put the reference to it in the reading materials and on the discussion board. And Benedict Kingsbury, who's at National New York University, he's basically asking this question whether or not indigenous peoples are in fact a sui generis entity, whether in fact, because indigenous peoples haven't really consented in much the same way as other people may have been said to consent, human rights law is doing something to those people over there. It hasn't asked those people over there what they think about human rights. Is that the best way to protect them? Is that not paternalistic? Probably is paternalistic. How do you get away from that? I think he's addressing some of those questions. Now, while Kingsbury's analysis pertains to indigenous peoples, it could just as well pertain to women in many societies. It could just as well pertain to groups that are further from sites of power. And that's really the question that we are trying to address. In terms of indigenous rights moving forward, there are significant challenges there, as the challenges are coming to the forefront really in the area of business and human rights. Because you often find indigenous peoples are located on regions that are mineral rich, often further away from capital cities, and those minerals are coming under scrutiny by multinational corporations who hope to get in there and hope to engage with it. And I wouldn't say exploit, because multinational corporations, I don't think, set out to exploit those the rights. There is exploitation that occurs. Whether that's willing or not willing is not really, it's not really fair, I think, to label all multinational corporations in that particular way. Exploitation of mineral resources can provide jobs, can provide remedies to society, but key to that is the extent to which the indigenous people who live there are genuinely considered to be stakeholders and have the right to consent. Cahill Doyle in subsequent weeks will speak about something called free, prior, informed consent. All four elements of consent, very important. The consent given has to be free, not coerced. The consent given has to be prior to the event. You can't seek consent after you've done something. You've got to seek consent before you do it. It's got to be based on full information. Very often, some of these discussions that have occurred with indigenous peoples have occurred on subterfuge. A great example, and if you want to read about this, you must look at the extent to which the colonization of New Zealand took place. A founding document there is the Treaty of Waitangi, consists of 3 articles only, but the Maori version and the English version vary tremendously. Now, guess which version the Maori chiefs signed? Well, they signed the version they could understand, the Maori version. Well, in that version, it doesn't talk at all about the Queen taking over their lands. It talks about working inequality. But the English version is quite different. So you see that even in the sense in which indigenous peoples have been seen to consent, they haven't had full information. They haven't understood what it is that's being put ahead of them. And their consent is considered to have been given nonetheless. So the consent has to be freely given. It's got to be before the event. It's got to be based on full information. And it's got to really be consent. Consent has to mean consent. Doesn't have to mean rubber stamping. So there are many of these questions that pertain to indigenous peoples that are of fundamental importance to the sustainable development agenda. Indigenous peoples, you would argue, have been the ones who have possibly been living their lives in the most sustainable manner. They haven't necessarily contributed to climate change in the way that the rest of society may have. So actually learning from indigenous systems and learning from indigenous methodologies and concepts may be beneficial. So indigenous peoples have a great stake in the environment. And I think we hope that one of the things we would encourage world policymakers to do is to look more at the extent to which indigenous cultures have been sustainable and have contributed to sustainability.
You've made me think of an interesting question for the discussion. In general, when you just said that you'd stop short of saying multinational corporations exploit and using that word, the question, if multinational corporations are driven by profit and are profit driven, to what extent must they necessarily exploit people and the planet if we're looking at extractive industries? And I think that's a question we could all usefully reflect on and discuss, because everyone would have different opinions on that. So there's a question for everybody to think about for the future. It's
an extremely valid question. I mean, the reason that I would stop short of labeling it is really a pragmatic one, in that I don't think where we are poised at this point in time, looking forward to 2030 and 2050, that we need to antagonize particular groups. We need to collaborate. I don't think collaboration is possible if I start thinking that X number of people are essentially violators and we are the good guys. So, in a sense, there is that element. We need to bring people to the table. We need to work collaboratively to it. I don't think naming and shaming necessarily is the best way to do that, but I think it's a great question to debate. Yeah,
I think the question is not about individual multinational corporate, but the system.
Yeah.
If it's profit driven, does it necessarily have to then be exploitative of people and the planet, or is there a different way of generating profit which is more just?
There you go.
In terms of the planet and people.
That's a question for you. Why don't you try and answer that? We'd love to hear from you, both in the discussion board and if you can deal with the technology through Google Hangout, as we are doing. Record your views on it. Do you agree with Sarah there? Is the profit motive going to be one which will always prevent sustainable development in that sense, because it would lead to exploitation of people and planet? Or is there a different take on it? We'd love to hear from you on that one. Okay, Sarah, why don't we move to the world in 2030? And there's a series of questions there. One of the questioners talks about how do you challenge current wisdom around these issues? How do you challenge conventional wisdom? And we thought we'd take a number of different themes and perhaps reflect on it. So Sarah, you were going to reflect on this concept of eco-human rights and also on gender and the extent to which...
Yeah, there was a question around whether we need to move towards an eco-human rights approach. Interesting question. An eco-human rights approach is not that well formulated in terms of what that would look like. And what we have is very much the human rights approach. And then we've got the idea of the environment, which is the broader sense. And then eco often uses the term to sort of tag on to, so eco-human rights. I find the environment is a huge subject and very, very broad. So I'm going to pick up on something that I've been thinking about recently. And one of the moves within environmental discourse is to this notion of ecosystems and ecosystem services. This is what a lot of people are talking about, very much in the Western world at the moment, but moving, as these things always do, into the development context. So lots of people talking ecosystem services. And what ecosystem services is getting at is that the environment provides services and what people call disservices, so benefits and disadvantages. So if you think about a tree in your backyard or back garden or in the street, it provides shade, it possibly provides fruit, it's beautiful to look at. This is the services it provides. I used to have a big mango tree where I used to live, and I lived in a house that had a zinc roof. Anyone who's lived under a mango tree with ripe mangoes will know when the mangoes fall off the tree, they make a lot of noise on your roof. Disservice the idea of ecosystem disservices. Now, you think, oh, that's fine. So what we're doing is trying to say that the environment should be looked at as an asset that then we can utilize for well-being of humans, but also to think about in terms of the planet. But the problem with ecosystem services, and this is the way I think it's going, rather than a rights direction, it's going more in this service direction. And ecosystem services, often what it results in is people trying to value it in a monetary term. Yeah. So how much do you value that tree in the street? What would you pay to keep that tree? And that's when we get a problem. So the idea of, should we systematically move towards an eco-human rights approach? Absolutely, we need to balance between the people and the planet. But my feeling is we're moving more towards this ecosystem services approach. And this services, this idea of putting a monetary value on the Earth's resources, not just the Earth's resources like the extractive industries, oil, but your tree in your backyard or in the street. What's the value we place on that? And what would you pay to keep that or to lose that? And I find that quite worrying in that sense, because that's not right. So we're back to services and we're back to commodification and fundarization. Don't know if you've...
No, I think that is a very good point. I mean, I would argue that, in a sense, human rights need to also be greened, that we do need to understand what human rights mean, and in terms of what human rights do. You know, there used to be an old classification in human rights literature where we talked about first generation rights and second generation rights. And essentially what we meant there was, oh, the real ones that are judicially enforceable are the first generation rights. That is the civil and political rights. Second generation rights, right to food, right to clothing, right to shelter, economic and social rights, well, that's a bit more difficult. Those are aspirations. But actually, even that model didn't address the fact that when you face human rights violations, you often face them as a group. So there's that third generation of rights. And I don't want you to learn this because, in a sense, I feel that model is outdated and it's been even in the literature now, it's not talked about anymore. But I'm just bringing that example to show you that human rights itself in its infancy failed to understand the group dimension. So for me, greening human rights is an agenda, but that means understanding the kind of dynamics and the kind of critiques that you've posed there, understanding what that means. And I think that's a challenge as well. Another challenge that I wanted to stress on here, really, because one of the questioners asked, well, how do we get that rate of change? Let me reflect on education. Obviously, education is part of the answer, but it can only be part of the answer if education does what it's trying to do. And we, so for instance, in doing this MOOC, believe in the value of education to generate social change, to generate questioning, to generate genuine interrogation. But the key with this particular interface also is the openness of it. That education for too long has been restricted to certain classes of people, certain men, in certain societies, and that's a problem. So we essentially have a series of pressing issues now to do with climate change, to do with the kinds of questions that Sarah is asking about multinational corporations, to do with what the ecology means in terms of human rights. We can no longer answer those questions by focusing on a small selection of humanity to come up with the answers. We need necessarily to be, metaphorically speaking, firing on all our cylinders. We need to be calling and drawing in as many of the world's cultures, populations, individuals as we possibly can to put their heads together and to try and come up with these kinds of answers, mainly because the answers we've come up with too often have been context specific. So if you have a world that's ultimately run by men, they are going to, either through conscious bias or unconscious bias, come up with a system that deals with their question. If you have a state that's run by the people who are the ethnic majority, they are either consciously or unconsciously going to come up with solutions that pertain to them. That's we're no longer fighting the dinosaurs. We need to understand that the kinds of challenges we are facing now are necessarily multidimensional, and that we need multidimensional approaches to solve them. That's a major conceptual challenge, because actually in education has often been used as a tool to differentiate person A from person B, and actually signaling that person A is educated, but person B, on the other hand, is not. So education has been used as a marker of difference. And that means that not everybody has been able to play in that educational space. And there has been something of an elitism to education, which we need to break through if we're going to solve the world's problems. And in this area of sustainable development, I go back to the indigenous peoples again. Indigenous peoples have had real answers, but those answers have not necessarily featured in the literature. And so those answers have not necessarily been created and generated into models. So the models that we have somehow don't derive from indigenous culture and indigenous takes on life. And we are the poorer for it. We are much poorer for it because we have many fewer answers. And the answers we have pertain very, very much towards each other. There's only nuance separating the kinds of answers and models we have. Whereas if we broaden that out to include the lived experiences of others, well, we might actually get a much wider range. So education is another one where conventional wisdom has to be challenged. I would say that, in a sense, it comes down to certainly the belief that Sarah and I share here in inclusivity and participation, that actually that is part of the answer. And that is already a major challenge to conventional wisdom, that we've always felt, oh, this is too important. I'm sorry, you don't have the background to answer this question. We are arguing you do. That even if you don't have the background, you have a perspective. Your perspective is important in us understanding the background, and actually in us understanding the background and having a meaningful engagement with you, we will both be richer for it. I think that's something of the ethos with regards to how you challenge conventional wisdom. And hopefully it addresses the question that also asked, what's the role of academia in this? Sarah, you wanted to say something about conventional wisdom and gender and how that could be challenged. And I know that you don't want to give too much away because there's a lot on the
coming
course
up.
there.
Keep watching. I think you're back to, obviously, education has been a big means to sort of try and think about engendering development. Education has been a big push on that, and absolutely right, and so it should be. And the value of educating girls is really important in itself. So for me, education is very much has an intrinsic worth. It's important just for everybody to be educated so they can fulfill their own life's ambitions and they can learn to think. And that's what education should be doing, to helping people learn to think more than anything else, and to critique and engage and get involved. My problem sometimes with how gender has been put into the vision post-2015 towards 2030 and with the indigenous peoples, because what we see with indigenous peoples is indigenous knowledges have been ignored quite often. But what has been not ignored is some indigenous knowledges which have been appropriated and used. And rather than indigenous knowledge being valued and being given worth and shared value, what we've seen is cherry picking from that. And so with gender, the World Bank, for example, has talked about women being an untapped resource. Education is really important for women, but not if that means they can go work in a factory in low paid employment doing repetitive, boring jobs because they're better at them, because they're socially constructed to sit quietly. So in that sense, we've got to think about how different groups are involved in the processes we're talking about. It's not just that they are involved, but it's the how that really, really matters. Indigenous people, women, across the gender spectrum. It's this idea we don't want to say, okay, gender's important, let's make it central to our agenda. Make it central to the agenda without thinking about why we're doing that, because this is an equality issue. It's not an efficiency issue, it's an equality issue, it's not an untapped resource. It's because we're back to fundamental human dignity. Absolutely. If we put human dignity as central, then all these things should follow. But while we think about this different group, what should we do with it, then in essence, we're not thinking from a human dignity perspective. No. And that's not an answer to what we should do. That's a concern I have. No, but I think in a sense, one of the things that we will hopefully do with you and with your participation in this particular course is to challenge our own conventional wisdoms. That there's a great line from an author I like very much, and those of you who read Spanish will have read it in Spanish, but Roberto Bolaño, a Colombian writer in 2001, I think the book is called 2001. He, for instance, says, we are all ignorant, we're just ignorant about different things. And I love that line, because essentially it is true. I don't know about rocket science. If tomorrow the question is going to be on rocket science, I'm ignorant. I need to be able to understand that I'm ignorant about it. I also need the wherewithal, if I have to understand rocket science, to be able to educate myself on what rocket science is. And I feel that that's part of it, and that's part of this particular mission that we have set ourselves. It's part of understanding what it is you don't know and giving yourself the tools to be able to tap into that. But ignorance should never be a way in which you differentiate one individual's inherent dignity and worth from another. It should merely be a statement of fact, and I guess
what follows that is a generation of an agenda of here's a bunch of things I now need to learn. And we all need to learn lots of things. And that doesn't always start from Plato. And it doesn't always start from understanding and speaking the English language fluently. There are all of these assumptions we make about what is knowledge. And actually, the assumptions we make about what knowledge is has narrowed our imagination so much that we're unable now to come up with sustainable solutions to climate change, unable to come up with sustainable solutions to how to manage migration flows, unable to get states and leaders who are meant to be forward-thinking visionaries to stop thinking about narrow personal agendas and narrow national agendas. That's what we've got to. And actually broadening that agenda is going to start with us learning what our ignorances are and learning to cope with them and not using them as a tool to differentiate one individual's worth from another. So there's a lot of challenging that I'm hoping we will do. We've certainly challenged ourselves in terms of putting the course together. We hope you will challenge us on these further. We want to hear your perspectives. We want to hear your take on these issues. They are fundamentally important. They're fundamentally important because debate for me is a great way of learning. It's a great way of building your own skills, but they're also great because you provide context. You can say, you know, Sarah, you did this great course on gender, but in the context that I'm in, this is how I see it. You could say, Joshua, I love this thing on socioeconomic rights, but it makes absolutely no sense in my context. Please explain further. And then don't just ask us to explain further, give us why. Tell us your perspectives on it. We would love to learn from you and the places that you are in. I think we only have one more question to deal with in terms of our groups, and apologies if we've left some of these out. And I think this is one where we do disagree on. So the role of law.
Here we go.
And whether or not human rights should be located in law or not. Sarah, you first, so I can refute you.
Oh. Should human rights be located in law? For me, the law is the first step on a ladder. And a ladder's there because you want to go up. And while we have human rights law, often what we do is stop on that first rung. And we go, okay, got the law now, we've got the right. Whereas the right means you have to actually climb the ladder and get to the top and achieve the right. Now, achieving the right, yes, you have to have the law, but the law isn't what the right's about. The right is about knowing about the right and understanding you have a right and understanding the notion of rights even. Because for some people, the idea of rights are just, it's a very difficult, even when I think to myself, what is a right? And if I have to like pinpoint, how do I know I've got a right? What rights do I have? If I sit and question it, then I begin to get myself all tangled up in circles around what rights do I actually know I have? And how do I know I have them? And to me, the legal system doesn't tell me that. The legal system tells me which rights have been agreed by those in power are the rights that are enshrined as rights and we can all have. But it doesn't tell me about what rights I might need or the rights that I feel or how I can live my rights, or it doesn't tell me really what rights are.
So now I'm going to disappoint those of you who are expecting a dramatic disagreement from me. I agree with that. I agree with that. I don't have any problem with any of what you've said in terms of human rights being the first step on the ladder, in terms of rights only being as good as they can be realized. I agree with that. The reason I think human rights should be, why I think human rights should be enshrined in law is, first of all, it's a statement of value. Societies need to make a statement of value. So let's take it much further back. Let's take it back to the purpose of law itself. So law, in a sense, was there initially, allegedly, to promote order and justice. But then the lawmakers, the primary lawmakers, were people who were landowners. Guess what kind of laws they made? They made laws to protect their land. So in a sense, the earliest laws were made by the powerful to protect the interests of the powerful. The question of justice was a secondary question there. It was mainly order that we were after. But I would argue it's not just order we need, it's a just order we need. And that getting that just order, an order that is truly just and has social justice at the heart of it, that's a bigger challenge. But I would never argue that a society that has laws is therefore a society that's human rights compliant. I would say that is the first point. That is the first step. For me, that signaling of intent is important. If you have societies that say all men and women are not equal, if you have societies that say only men can apply for certain posts, you're not even signaling that at the highest level, there's the aspiration for this equality. You need to signal that aspiration, but if you leave it in your books, in a dusty archive of a capital city, it's meaningless. You need to then make those real, and that may be through the educational mandate, that may be through getting societies to challenge the values that they hold, and it may be through advocacy. It may be through actually taking people to court for violating the rights and saying, you know what, I tried to put the pragmatic and the moral argument to you, you didn't accept it, so you have to pay for it now in a legal sense. So that would be why I would argue that human rights need to be enshrined in law. But clearly, just remember that anything that is written down, certainly and codified at international level, will necessarily be the lowest common denominator. You will never get states agreeing to do anything that's higher than the lowest common denominator. So in a sense, rights are a distilled version of what are just basic. In that sense,
but that's
exactly why I agree with you. But that's exactly why I agree with you. It's got to be the starting. It's got to be the first step.
But maybe it shouldn't be the starting point, because that's the problem. That we just come down to this very basic notion and we say, well, that's it then, we've got it. And we don't aspire any further because there's your rights.
Yeah.
And we don't start thinking about those rights we don't have. We just think about those rights that are enshrined now as rights, and we know as rights, and we don't think, well, you know, are there other issues out there that should be rights that aren't rights?
Okay,
so the notion of order and the notion of, yes, we know it's the basic, you know, it's the lowest common denominator, then really, do we really want and need them then?
Yeah, so I would argue we do, because I would argue that many societies, even though they have them, violate them. So imagine if they didn't have them at all. Then we're back to the law of the jungle. Then I don't need to have any kind of codification to justify why I need to behave in a particular way with you. What law tries to do is it tries to regulate behavior in a public space. And that if you don't like me, you might not like me, you might choose to think that I'm less than you. But if you in a public space manifest that in any meaningful way, well, I have a recompense to you. Now, it's true that rights are violated, but that's like saying, well, just because you might have your wallet stolen or something stolen from your house, that there is no criminal law. Well, there is, but rights are violated all the time. So in a sense, the fact that they exist is not the problem. The fact that they're not implemented is a major problem. And the fact that they're not implemented is a major source of what I would have defined earlier as a human wrong. So the implementation is what we need to focus on. Whether we have them or not, we have them now. Dismantling them, well, is it really worth it? Would it make it a better world? I would say it wouldn't. But even if you thought it would make it a better world, I would say, well, what's the opportunity cost of spending that time destroying a system that has been built? And from the work that I have done, certainly with NGO communities around the world, it's a beacon of hope. It provides people hope. It provides people with hope that they will have accountability for the violations they have suffered, and for the fact that ultimately it's a way of holding power to account. Does it do it successfully? No, it doesn't, but that doesn't necessarily mean it shouldn't exist.
I don't think we should do away with laws completely, or laws around rights.
Thank you, Sarah.
That's okay. I want to keep you in a profession.
Good.
But on the other hand, the question was, if human rights are not located in law, then where should they be located? And for me, human rights should be located in the society, in the people, in how people act and how people understand, and it's an attitude thing more than a legal thing. So I think we're arguing, yes, we should have laws, but if laws aren't understood, they don't mean anything. So where should they be located? Rights then for me should be located in the education system, should be located in conversations in the daily life. They're not something to be thought about as up there and out there. They're something we should be having a discussion around and thinking about, and are they adequate? Are they enough? Are they what we think? Are they doing what they should do? And therefore they need to be located back within society, as it were, and out from the legal profession. So I'm disservicing you now, out from the legal profession, out from the academia, out from the criminality and the police, and back into the daily discussions of people. That's where they should be. And
they should be there without a doubt. And I just don't see that because they're there, they can't be anywhere else. Because essentially, one of the things that human rights tries to do, and human rights law tries to do, is to equip people with the capability to speak truth to power. Does it do it successfully? No, it doesn't. It does. If you look at the journey traveled, we have made progresses in progress that can be measured in inches, when we should be making progresses in thousands of miles, if not millions. but progress nonetheless. Progress is a line there about the level of acceptable behavior that pertains to society. To make it real, it has to be in society. It has to be in discussions. It has to be in education. But very often, if it that is even a much more ambitious quest, and that's the quest we need to be on. Human rights being in law is only a small first step towards it. Okay, well, we hope that you got something out of that. We certainly enjoyed it. We hope to do it more often, and we hope that you will come back to us on questions, disagreements. By the way, do use the video function if you know how it works. We've been fortunate enough that somebody showed us, and my thanks to Rebecca, who's sitting here beside us.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Who taught us how to use this forum. It is pretty easy to use if you go to the website. Again, we can put some instructions on the discussion board if it'll help you. We'd love to see you. We'd love to hear you. We'd love the rest of the student community to hear you as well. Because in a sense, we genuinely believe that this is a quest that we are all embarking on together. And the more we can see you, hear from you, identify you, the more realistic this can be as a conversation. MOOCs are great because they allow you that kind of access, but they can be one-sided. And I think making this real, getting your participation, getting your views would be very, very useful. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope to see you shortly.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.